You're watching GMT on BBC World News. Our top stories: a diver becomes the first casualty in the operation to free 12 boys from a cave in Thailand. He'd volunteered to help. He lost consciousness on the way back from delivering supplies to the cave where the boys are trapped. Brexit showdown in Britain. Theresa May and her cabinet meet to try to agree on a plan for the country's future relations with Europe, but sharp divisions remain. The American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo returns to North Korea to press for details on the dismantling of that country's nuclear program.
And here in Russia, after a two-day break, we're set for the first two quarter-finals in the World Cup. France take on Uruguay, Brazil face Belgium.
Also in the programme, Aaron is here. And Aaron, the gloves are now well and truly off between the US and China.
Matty, it's on for young and old. Yeah, China has accused the US of starting the largest trade war in economic history. Yeah, the tariffs are here. Washington is now taxing $34 billion of Chinese goods, and Beijing is now doing the same on $34 billion of American-made stuff. Look, stay with us. We're going to take a look at how all of this is going to affect all of us.
Hello and welcome to GMT. I'm Matthew Price. We are going to start in Thailand, where there is now intense pressure on officials who are hatching their plan to rescue 12 boys and their football coach trapped in a cave. In the past few hours, tragedy. One of the volunteer divers who had been delivering oxygen to the chamber where the boys are stuck didn't make it out alive. From the cave complex, Dan Johnson has sent us this report.
Well, this is one part of the rescue operation, the attempt to pump water out of the cave to try and reduce the water level. That's a really tough effort because it requires millions of water being pumped every hour, and there is rain threatened. In fact, it's been raining this morning already, and the real threat that is, if the rain really gets heavy, then the water level in the cave that one of the divers, a former member of the Navy, who actually left and was working in security at Bangkok airport, he'd to where the children are stranded, and it was on his way out that his with different teams coming in and out, trying to work out what the best way is going to be to get these boys free. It's not just pumping the water, they're also trying to work out if they can teach the boys to swim. Urgency to this rescue mission and the sadness that it has already claimed someone's life.
Yeah, Dan Johnson there in Thailand. Let's go to the live shots now outside the cave complex. That is what is happening at the moment, and we're seeing throughout the day and the previous days, of course, intense activity out there with officials and experts wandering in and out of that complex. Others, of course, going into the caves themselves. An incredibly difficult operation in progress, as Dan Johnson was outlining for us. I want to bring in Iani Santala, who's a cave diving instructor. And Iani, you join us from Chimay in Belgium. Thank you very much for joining us. I just wonder, with your expertise in this sort of thing, what is the key problem here at the moment? Oxygen levels or water levels?
I think it's both. You can't separate them. There's no certainty of keeping the water out and keeping it dry, but I think the more immediate threat is the oxygen levels dropping.
And if we show some pictures now, just while I'm talking to you, from inside the cave complex itself, that's outside at the moment, but inside the cave complex there, this is the sort of conditions that these incredibly brave divers are working in. The water level's very high indeed. I wonder, we've had this awful story of one of the rescuers dying in the process here. And we're also getting, Iani, this information through that oxygen levels in the cave itself are low. Normally air contains, what, 20% of oxygen, and in the cave we're being told it's 15%. Does that have an impact on what the rescuers themselves can do, how they're operating?
Well, of course, the levels of oxygen are important, how well you are performing yourself. If it goes down.
And what does that mean for the rescuers? Looks like we've lost your line, unfortunately. I mean, we'll go back to the pictures, the live pictures outside the cave complex itself at the moment, as we take a look at what is happening there at the moment. So just to recap, on Monday it looked remarkably hopeful. They had found these boys alive. Now the problems seem to be mounting for the rescuers, and there is a race on to decide how to get them out. If that race develops during the course of the programme, we will bring you information, of course, on it here on BBC World News. Let's move on to one of the other big stories of the day. The United States has officially fired the first shots in a trade war with China. American sanctions against some Chinese products have come into force. The Chinese Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, says China will never start a trade war, and it is never the answer, but he has promised that steps will be taken to protect Beijing's interests. And China has imposed its own taxes on American produce. As John Sudworth reports, this could just be the start of the war.
Here's just one of the products on the US tariff list. 12,000 of these Chinese-built machines have been shipped to America this year, a trade that's about to be flattened.
An extra 25% tax, of course, affects us very much. It will reduce our potential profits.
Is CF Moto stealing American jobs?
If you take a look at our factory, you realize we've got where we are on our own strength and by respecting international rules.
But such individual protests are now in vain. China's incredible economic success, Donald Trump argues, has been built on bending the rules. In particular, the large-scale theft of US intellectual property. Tariffs, he hopes, will force China to change its behaviour. China hopes its matching tariffs on US imports will force America to back off. If it's not yet a fully fledged trade war, then it's the beginnings of one. Mr. Trump is threatening a massive escalation, moving beyond the relatively obscure products on the current list to almost everything China produces. For decades, successive US presidents have, whatever the difficulties and differences, seen trade with China as a good thing. Not anymore. Donald Trump is doing precisely what he said he would on the campaign trail, taking the fight to factories like this one, where falling orders may very quickly translate into lost jobs. The world's two largest economies are careering into the unknown. There's little sign of meaningful dialogue, and no one seems ready to put on the brakes. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
So in that developing story, Aaron, of course, a lot more on that trade war in the business during the course of the programme. But in other news, the founder of a Japanese doomsday cult which carried out a deadly attack on the Tokyo subway using the nerve agent sarin has been executed. Japanese media say 6 followers of Shoko Asahara, the leader of the group, Om Shimuriko, have also been put to death. 13 people were killed in the subway attack back in 1995. Iran has warned it could leave the 2015 nuclear accord if it is not fully compensated for the reimposition of US sanctions. Ministers from Britain, France, Germany, China and Russia met their Iranian counterpart in Austria on Friday for the first time since Donald Trump pulled America out of the pact back in May. The European powers have acknowledged that their offer of economic benefits to lessen the blow of American sanctions are unlikely to satisfy Iran. Many parts of the Northern Hemisphere have been feeling the heat recently. In Canada, officials say 33 people have died in a heat wave scorching the southern part of the province of Quebec. The hot weather began a week ago with temperatures hitting 35 degrees Celsius with high humidity. Officials are urging people to drink plenty of water and stay in the shade. Now, I'm afraid there is more grim news from Thailand today. Dozens of tourists are missing after a boat capsized off the resort island of Phuket. At least 27 bodies have been recovered. Rebecca Lee reports.
What started as a holiday adventure in Thailand ended in tragedy when 2 tourist boats capsized off the coast of Phuket Island early on Thursday evening. The Phoenix was carrying 105 passengers. A majority of those were Chinese tourists. Rescue teams searched for the passengers in the dark and in heavy seas, bringing 48 people to safety before the search was called off for the night. Despite a weather warning, the boat had set out for a day trip from Phuket when it was pummeled by 5-metre waves.
After the first wave hit the boat, rubbish got into the engine, so draining the system was not working fast enough to keep the boat steady. Then more waves hit rapidly. The boat leaned to one side and then it capsized.
As the rescue efforts resumed on Friday morning, many bodies were recovered by Thailand's Navy, leaving little hope for those still missing.
The tourist boat is now on the seabed. HMS Long Long found it using a sonar scan.
A second boat was also overturned in the rough waters. All 39 passengers were rescued and brought to shore. Other smaller boats have been reported stranded at sea, caught up in strong winds, common during Thailand's monsoon season. Rebecca Lee, BBC News.
Confusion, conflict and a clash of political powers. Brexit talks here in the UK now resemble a Shakespearean play. Today, all the characters are on stage. Theresa May is hosting talks at the Prime Minister's country house, Chequers. Her goal is to convince her own governing party to agree, finally, a blueprint for the UK's future relationship with the European Union. But there are deep splits, it won't surprise you, within her cabinet. Now, with everyone in place, ministers have been told that they actually have to hand in their telephones and any smartwatches on arrival at Chequers later. And our UK political correspondent Rob Watson is outside the meetings and joins us. Rob, presumably handing in smartphones so that nothing leaks out, so that they, in that house behind you, finally agree on something?
Well, that's the general idea. And of course, handing in the phones so as they don't start leaking to people like me and the others around me in this rather lovely field. But I mean, just to sort of focus back for a second, I mean, it is now more than 2 years since the referendum vote, 9 months until Britain officially leaves the European Union. And it is worth just stating again that the government has not been able to agree on what Britain's future relationship with the European Union should be. And that is simply because the governing Conservative Party is just deeply divided about how close or distant that future relationship should be now. Up until now, by the end of this crunch meeting, this latest crunch meeting, there really was a decision of some kind or another.
I'm sure, Rob, like all proper English country houses, that one has an east wing and a west wing. And if you've got one camp in the east wing and one camp in the west wing, what are their different visions?
So I guess rather than using the wings of the houses, we could just put it in terms of who is really enthusiastic about Brexit and who thinks more that leaving the European Union is a question of damage limitation. And those who are enthusiastic about Brexit, to put a name out there that everyone would know, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, and there are about 6 or 7 other cabinet ministers out of the 30 who are also pretty gung-ho, and they think really that Britain should have a much more distant relationship with the European Union. Yes, trade, yes, be friends, but not be in any way part of its institutions. Now, there's another wing that I guess we would see it more as I mentioned, damage limitation. That's the Chancellor, Mr. Hammond, who really think that Britain just simply must stay close to the European Union in terms of trade, stay there economically, because otherwise it would just be a catastrophe for jobs and business.
And if Rob, briefly, they come up with a plan today that is acceptable to both sides, is that then what happens?
Well, not exactly, because first of all, you've then got to sell it to Parliament, you've got to sell it to the British people, you've got to sell it to British businesses, but perhaps trickiest of all, you've got to start selling it to the EU 27, who've basically said this, and it's worth remembering briefly, Matthew. They've said, look, we understand Britain is leaving, we don't want to have a row with you, we want to stay mates, but you can't have a better deal outside the EU or as good a deal outside the EU as you had when you were in it. That's the dynamic, Matthew.
All right, well, enjoy the sunshine, even if not the contact with those inside, Rob. Thank you very, very much indeed. Stay with us on BBC World News. Still to come, a huge history-making week ahead for Donald Trump.